Move your boat now. The scream from Karen Whitmore, the HOA president in a light-colored suit, echoed across the lake like a command to a servant. I sat on the boat, took a sip of coffee, looked her straight in the eye, and said each word clearly. You have no idea. This lake belongs to me. The crowd held its breath. The self-proclaimed authority figure suddenly revealed a tremble as the truth hit her. That moment wasn't just a shot of satisfaction. It was a reminder that injustice and discrimination always come to light one day. She stood frozen, her power cracking in real time. The silence around us wasn't confusion, it was realization. People started to look at her differently, like a mask had been ripped away. Everything changed in an instant. The lines between control and reality blurred. And for once, someone who thought they were untouchable was brought to the ground by nothing more than fact. Do you think Karen deserved this bitter ending? Drop your comment now. That morning, the sky stretched out like a thin blue sheet, clear and soft, with a few white clouds drifting lazily as the early sunlight gently touched the lake's surface. I had chosen to wake up early, bringing along the old wooden boat I still polished by hand every weekend. The boat was no longer new, the paint chipped and peeling in places, but to me, it was a piece of memory, a vessel that once carried my family around the lake, the spot where I sat with my daughter fishing on quiet days when my wife was still alive. Every scratch on that boat held a story, a laugh, a peaceful afternoon I could never reclaim. Today, I brought it back to the lake not just fish, but to find a sliver of stillness, a short moment for my mind to breathe, for those memories to stir again. Cast my line and sat quietly, watching the calm water reflect the sunlight, listening to the bird song in the trees along the shore, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was just me, the boat, and a wide-open lake. A steaming cup of hot coffee sat beside my chair, its rich aroma curling through the air. I took a small sip, the bitter sweetness sharpening my mind, while also pulling up fragments of memory that never quite faded. For a moment, I saw my wife's silhouette flicker in my thought, her gentle smile as she once sat right here, softly adjusting the fishing rod in our daughter's hand. Now it was only me, holding on to these scattered pieces against the growing emptiness. I thought I would have a few uninterrupted hours like that, but the silence was quickly shattered by the sharp sound of heels hitting the wooden dock. The dry staccato rhythm cut through the stillness, dragging me out of that short dream of peaceful days. I looked up and saw a woman striding toward. Karen Whitmore, HOA president, is a woman known throughout the neighborhood for her domineering nature and belief that she alone defines what is acceptable. She wore a crisp, light-colored, pressed to perfection without a single wrinkle, as if both her appearance and her behavior were meant to broadcast a single message: I am authority. Two HOA members followed closely behind, note pens and ready to document any possible violence. The sight of the three of them made the shoreline feel like a place of, and more like a stage. Power. Karen stopped at the edge of the wooden dock, her face expressionless, but her eyes filled with disdain. She raised her hand in one abrupt motion, and then her shrill voice snapped through the air, so harsh the lake itself seemed to flinch. Move your boat, now! That shout wasn't just a command. It was a slap across the calm I had fought to hold on to. It wasn't a normal reminder. It felt like an insult, as if I were nothing more than an intruder who didn't belong here. I sat still, lifted my face, and looked directly into that defiant stare. In that moment, I could feel the full weight of her contempt. Karen hadn't come because of the boat. She came to make a point. Anyone outside the control of the HOA would be crushed. I hadn't even spoken when she took another step forward, her voice rising sharper. This lake isn't a place where anyone can just dock. Do you think this is a public park? The final words were emphasized, as if she wanted every resident around the lake to hear them, to turn me into a living example for anyone daring to challenge her authority. I felt my hand tighten around the fishing rod, the veins pushing up along my wrist. A surge of anger was rising inside me, but I knew I couldn't let it explode here. I had to stay calm, even as every word she threw landed like a blade in my pride. I drew a deep breath, then answered slowly, my voice steady. I'm just sitting here, fishing. I'm not bothering anyone. I didn't want to turn this into a public scene right away. I believed that by staying composed, some of the onlookers might start to see just how unreasonable her behavior was. Karen had never cared about reason. She scoffed, curling her lip into a sneer, her eyes sweeping over my boat as if it were a piece of trash. You don't belong in this community. We maintain standards. We don't let old boats ruin the view. Every word she spoke dropped with a cold, biting weight. I heard a few neighbors nearby snicker. Some shook their heads. One even clicked their tongue as if I had committed some kind of offense. Inside me, memories of quiet mornings on the boat with my family came rushing back, completely at odds with what stood before me now. Back then, laughter echoed over the water, And no one cared whether the boat was old or new. There was only the simple joy of pulling up a small fish, only the peace of three people sitting close together. Now, that picture had been wiped away by a woman standing on shore, hands on her hip, barking orders, turning the lake into a stage for her cheap display of power. I could see it clearly in Karen's eye. She believed I would back down, move the boat to avoid trouble. Because for years, many had done just that. They chose silence over confrontation, chose to bow their heads just to be left alone. But I knew silence only feeds her arrogance, and if I stayed silent today, someone else would face the same thing tomorrow. I said nothing, just took a slow sip of coffee, keeping my gaze steady and calm. Karen read that silence in her own way, as submission. Her smirk grew, her eyes gleamed with triumph. The two HOA members behind her had already pulled out clipboards and started writing. I caught snippets like code violation and visual disruption, and I knew a citation was already being drafted. The way they worked, cold, mechanical, left me tired. To them, the rules weren't about fairness. They were tools of control. I stayed still, but inside me, fire had ignited. I said nothing more, because I knew the moment to speak hadn't come yet. Anger needed to be held back, honed, so when it was finally unleashed, it wouldn't just be resistance. It would be a strike straight at the heart of arrogance standing before me. That lakeside morning, instead of the quiet I had hoped for, had turned into an arena. The watching eyes, the whispering voices, the scratch of pens on paper, it all thickened the air. I understood then, this moment was only the beginning. And from here, an unavoidable confrontation was beginning to take shape. One I knew would shift how this entire community viewed the power of the HOA. Karen believed she had just cemented her authority, but she didn't realize that this moment had already lit fuse for her own unraveling. Karen Whitmore tilted her head back and let out a half laugh, the sound echoing as if to make sure everyone standing along the lake could hear it. She didn't stop at shouting at me. She turned to the cluster of residents nearby, her shrill voice rising even higher, full of performance. "See, I told you, these new people, sloppy, no sense of standard." Her words dropped onto the lake like a heavy stone, sending out small ripples across the surface, just as they stirred a reaction among the crowd, turning every gaze toward me. I could feel the weight of every scrutinizing look. Some eyes gleamed with cruel amusement, as if they were watching a public spectacle, a play in which I had been cast target of humiliation. A few people shook their head, lips curling into thin smirks like I'd seen this before and no longer found it surprising. In their eyes, I was no longer a person with dignity, but a lowly outsider, publicly named and shamed in front of them all. The air grew thick, filled with a complicit silence wrapped in bitter laughter. In my chest, my breath grew heavy, blood rushing to my head. I felt heat rise beneath my skin. My fists clenched so tight my nails dug into my palm. I wanted to shout back, to tell them I had every right to be here, that I was no less than any of them, but I held back. I wanted to see just how shameless Karen could be, how far she would go in her public humiliation, and how long the crowd would stay quiet while watching this unfold. My silence wasn't submission, it was a calculated choice, a measure of just how far this indecency would stretch. Karen didn't make me wait. She stood upright, chin raised, her voice hissing through her teeth like someone used to barking orders. "If you want to live here, learn to stay quiet, follow command." The words dropped into the air, cutting through every other sound. A few people in the crowd laughed. Others glanced at me with a hollow kind of pity, as if they believed I was about to be crushed beneath the heel of power. I looked around. This place had once been the reason I chose to start a new chapter in my life, a place I believed would offer peace, a space where my daughter and I could begin to heal. I remembered the early days after we moved in, when we still held on to the promises from those glossy brochures about a friendly, safe, and civilized community. But what I saw now was a stage where the strong imposed their will, and sour smiles turned silence into complicity. In my mind, memories of my wife returned, how she used to remind me to stay calm in any situation. I could hear her voice clearly in my head, gently saying, "Wait for the right moment. Don't waste your energy on a pointless argument." That memory held me steady, anchored me against the rising tide of fury. I wouldn't let Karen see me break, because that was what she craved, to witness that collapse, that surrender. I wasn't going to give it to her. Karen turned slightly, a victorious smile spreading across her face. She believed she had won, that I had been pushed into silence, that once again the community would fall in line behind her, because no one dared to defy her. But in my eyes, the stillness was no longer it was a buildup, the slow burn of a fire waiting to erupt. The more I was humiliated, the more certain I became that one day this entire shell of false authority would be stripped away. An older man nearby clicked his tongue and looked away, as if unwilling to watch any longer. I caught a flicker of sympathy in his eyes, but it quickly vanished, placed by weariness. Maybe he had once been a target of Karen's, too, had tasted the sting of public humiliation, and now chose to turn his back, to stay out of it rather than be dragged into the cycle again. I realized then that the crowd's silence didn't mean agreement. They were simply too afraid, tired, or too used to living under this kind of fear. Is a kind of guilt, too, because it feeds people like Karen, makes them stronger. Karen's voice rang out again. No microphone, no speaker, but every word carried across the lake. She spoke of community standards, of protecting property value, of preserving the image of Lakeside Estate. Every phrase wrapped in a polished shell, yet filled with blatant contempt for anyone she deemed unworthy to live here. I looked at her face, her lips pressed into a tight, rehearsed smile, the smile of someone used to looking down from above. In that voice I heard the hunger for control, the satisfaction she found in breaking people down, one family at a time, through citations and shouted commands. My chest was still burning, but the anger had been contained. I knew I wouldn't strike back now. I let her believe she had won, let her take one more step into her arrogance, because the further she went, the harder she would fall. I felt the corner of my mouth lift, not in joy, but in a silent promise. I would remember every word, every stare, every mocking laugh from today, and someday, right here, they would all witness the complete reversal. Karen ended with the phrase, "Stay quiet and follow orders," as if hammering the final nail into the coffin of freedom she was busy burying the entire neighborhood in. But she didn't know that nail also sparked flame of resistance inside me. I didn't take my eyes off her. I made sure she saw my gaze, not the gaze of someone defeated, but of someone waiting for the right moment. She didn't understand that my silence now wasn't surrender. It was preparation for the real battle, and in that battle, Karen would be made to taste every bitter word she threw at me today. As Karen Whitmore stood there, basking in her victory, I suspected the public humiliation wouldn't end with just her word, and I was right. From behind her, one of the two HOA members stepped forward, holding a crisp white sheet of paper, its corners still slightly curled as if it had been printed in a hurry. He didn't say much. He simply extended it in front of me, his voice flat and dry, pronouncing each word like reading a sentence. "Boat is an eyesore, in violation of HOA regulation." The paper glinted under the morning light, and the bolded words at the bottom, $500, jumped straight into my vision. I heard murmurs ripple through the crowd. Someone let out a soft whistle, and another smirked. All eyes turned to me as if waiting to see the reaction of someone just condemned in a public square. I reached out and took the paper, the sharp letters stabbing at my eyes. The absurd reasoning written there read like a joke, but it held the weight of a weapon the HOA used to manipulate its residents. I looked up, locking eyes with Karen. She stood upright, arms folded, gaze full of pride and challenge. I asked, my voice slow but loud enough for everyone to hear, based on what? I wanted the words to come from her own mouth, wanted her to expose herself. Karen didn't hesitate. She lifted her chin and replied, her voice shrill and final, like a royal decree, based on my authority. In that moment, heat surged through my body. It wasn't about the money, I could pay 5 times that without blinking, but about the public shaming, the blatant audacity. I didn't see a single cited rule, no reference to any policy, only 4 words, my authority. That kind of power didn't come from laconic, but from arrogance fed by silence that had lasted far too long. The murmuring began again, and a few people burst into laughter. A woman in an elegant coat whispered to her friend, "He really thinks he can get past Karen?" Ridiculous. Each whisper cut like a knife, but I kept my eyes locked on Karen, as if engraving this moment into memory so I would never forget. I looked at the paper again. The number 500 meant nothing compared to how it had been delivered. That citation wasn't just a fine. It was a declaration that I didn't belong here, that I had to pay for daring to exist in this place on my own terms. I thought of my daughter, thought of the look in her eyes whenever I spoke of the injustices of the HOA. I wondered, if she saw this scene, would she still believe that fairness was real? The anger roared within me, my chest burned, and my heart pounded so hard it felt like it might break through my rib. Forced myself to slow my breathing, to keep from letting angry words slip out. I knew that if I reacted with rage now, she would be satisfied. She would have her excuse to keep using me as a public example of rebellion crushed. I thought of the neighbors who had told me about being fined by Karen for hanging a flag on their porch, for planting flowers not listed on the approved list, and for rolling their trash bins to the curb a few minutes too early. They had all paid for it. Many eventually chose to sell their home, leaving quietly, behind them only stories that were never told aloud. I couldn't allow myself to become one of them. Thought flashed through my mind, sharp as lightning. This wasn't about a citation anymore. This was a public dare. I looked at Karen, at the half smile she wore as she watched me stay silent. She thought I had given in, that silence meant, but I knew this moment was the beginning of a fight she didn't see coming. I folded the paper and slid it into my jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately. I didn't argue, didn't resist, didn't bow. I let her believe she had won, let her take another step into the trap built by her own arrogance. I turned to the lake, the sunlight dancing across the water like a sheet of glass. The lake no longer looked peaceful. It mirrored my mood now, calm on the surface but holding hidden currents beneath. I sat down in the boat, reset the fishing rod, and the coffee cup beside me was still faintly warm. I took a small sip, the bitterness spreading across my tongue, and inside me, a plan began to form. I didn't need to shout to resist. I needed evidence. I needed timing. And when those things came together, the blow I would strike would leave Karen unable to rise again. The sound of footsteps faded. Karen and the two behind her walked back down the path. I saw her stride, shoulders high, full of the pride of someone who thought she had won. She believed I had been broken, that I would quietly pay the fine and bow my head. She had no idea that her arrogance had just given me the strongest reason to rise. I knew from this day forward I would no longer be just another resident under the HOA's thumb. I would be the one who challenged the entire illusion of power she clung to, and I also knew that once it began there would be no turning back. In my mind, fragments of information started falling into place. I remembered a passing conversation with Mr. Merrick, the elderly neighbor who once mentioned that the lake had a complicated legal history. I remembered the frustrated look in Samuel's eye, another resident who had been targeted by Karen too many times. I knew I wasn't alone. These fragments, these overlooked stories, were now weaving into the rope pulling me out of submission. I understood now. If I was going to bring Karen down, couldn't go after the surf. I had to strike at the very foundation of the power she believed stood on. I sat there, eyes on the lake, mind unsettled, clear. $500 citation wasn't enough to break. On the contrary, it was the spark that lit the fire for a battle Karen would never forget. I took a deep breath, letting it fill my chest, letting the anger shift into energy, into resolve. She thought she had just made her point, but in truth, she had just created her most dangerous adversary. And from this moment on, I would no longer be the man sitting silently in the boat, taking her insult. I would be the one who seized the board and turned it in ways Karen could never predict. If it were you, faced with this kind of abuse from the HOA, what would you do? Leave a comment below. After holding that absurd citation in my hand and swallowing the public humiliation in front of the community, I knew I had to start looking more closely at how this HOA operated. I spent days observing, listening, and connecting with neighbors who had stayed silent far too long. I spoke with families who had been fined before, the ones who always kept their heads down and avoided eye contact whenever they passed by Karen Whitmore's house. The first answers were all the same, delivered with sighs. If you want peace, don't get involved with the HOA. Stay quiet, stay invisible. But I didn't stop at vague answers. I went further, quietly watching the lake during late afternoons and week times when no one expected to be watched. And I saw what Karen had tried to hide, the real core of all the troll. They had a fishing club. On the surface, it sounded like a harmless little community group, but in truth, it was a private circle of privilege. The club wasn't public, there were no official announcements on the community board, and it wasn't mentioned in the thick stack of HOA regulations they used to intimidate residents. It existed quietly, open only to friends and close associates of the board, people tied together by mutual interest. With each new piece of information, the puzzle started coming together. The standards Karen repeated over and over were nothing more than a facade, a shield behind which certain people could do whatever they pleased. One evening, I decided to go to the lake itself. Yellow light from the row of homes along the shore spilled onto the water in hazy I stood at a distance, far enough to stay unseen, but close enough to observe a group of people gathering. I heard loud voices, pop of beer cans opening, and the smell of grilled meat drifting into the night air. They had set up a full mobile grill, arranged tables and chairs, strung up light, turning one corner of the lake into a party. Fishing rods scattered everywhere, nets tossed on the grass, bait box left open and reeking on the ground, beer bottles, soda cans littered all. Stood in silence, wondering where all the environment community. No one. A few board members were even there. Laughed. I remembered the image of Karen standing in front of me, pointing at my boat, shouting that it made the community look bad. I remembered the citation that said I was damaging the visual appeal. So what was that scene by the lake if not actual ugliness? And yet, instead of being condemned, they were enabled. Every rule was just a noose for those who didn't belong to their circle, while for those inside, the rules evaporated like they had never existed. On another day, I happened to overhear the story of the Johnson family, a black family living on the edge of the neighborhood. Mr. Johnson had 2 young sons who loved to They brought along an old set of rods. The lines were frayed and their bait was scarce. But the moment they stepped onto the lakeshore, Karen appeared, her voice cutting through the air, ordering them to leave. She claimed the lake was a maintenance zone. But minutes later, the familiar fishing club group showed up and took over the same spot. The 2 Johnson boys stood frozen, their eyes red from being chased off so unfairly. Their father simply bowed his head and walked them away, his shoulders heavy. No one spoke up. No one dared to intervene. That was the unspoken law here. If you were black, poor, and unknown, don't dream of touching the lake. When I heard that story, my blood boiled. I pictured the 2 boys with their rusty rods, their excited expressions turning to hurt in a flash. The same lake, the same hobby. But one side was welcomed while the other was cast out like beggars. Karen and her group had turned the community lake into their private backyard, handing out permission to exist however they pleased. The injustice had gone beyond abuse of power. It had become blatant discrimination, aimed at skin color and class. I kept watching, again and again, and every time it was the same. That fishing club would roll in like they owned the place. Loud, late into the night, leaving behind piles of trash that no one touched. They laughed loudly, toasted each other, and talked about preserving community values while their behavior lay bare the lie. I stood at a distance, feeling like I was watching a farce, one where the powerful played the role of guardians of standard, when in truth they were just a small interest group feasting off the backs of others. Each piece began to fit, and the picture became clear. Those citations weren't meant to keep order. They were meant to eliminate anyone not of the right blood. The shouting wasn't about aesthetic. It was a smokescreen for quiet privilege. The HOA's fishing club was a microcosm of the whole neighborhood, a double-faced world. One face was cold, and rules were slammed down on regular residents. The other was gleaming privilege hidden in the shadows. Something inside me shifted. I knew then that the citation I received wasn't the destination. It was just the tip of the iceberg. The deeper, dirtier part was this kind of privilege. And having seen it with my own eyes, I understood clearly. The rules here were never meant to protect fairness. They existed only to pave the way for Karen's circle to enjoy everything unchecked. A hidden twist emerged. All the pretty words, all the citations, all the talk of maintaining standards were nothing but a false shield. The true nature was discrimination, favoritism, and indulgence for a circle of close friends. I looked at the lake and for the first time saw it not as a peaceful place to fish, but as a battlefield where the truth needed to be exposed. And I swore to myself I would not let the story of the Johnson family, or any other family, be buried in silence again. I walked away from the lakeshore, my steps low and heavy, but my mind clearer than ever. I knew this confrontation was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. Karen and her club had grown far too used to imposing their will and being applauded for it. But this time, they had chosen the wrong person to humiliate. And when I began to flip the board, the very first thing dragged into the light would be that seemingly harmless fishing club. The next morning, just as I stepped out to the lake, Karen Whitmore appeared with a larger group than usual. It was no longer just the 2 HOA members trailing behind her. This time, she brought nearly a dozen people, including several familiar faces I recognized as longtime residents who had always remained silent during meetings. They stood in a messy line behind her, their eyes filled with a mix of curiosity, caution, and a hint of satisfaction, as if they were watching a public reckoning. Karen stepped forward, her high heels clacking sharply on the wooden dock, her voice ice cold as it rang out. "If you don't move the boat within 24 hours, the HOA will forcibly remove it." The statement was short, but it echoed like a verdict. The people behind her nodded in unison. Some pulled out their phones to record. Others bent down to pretend they were taking notes. I looked around and felt the imbalance clearly. They were using numbers to apply pressure, trying to turn me into the lone man standing against the whole community. Karen stood in the center of the group, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction, faint smiles stretching across her face like a final warning, either bow and comply or be crushed. I didn't respond right away. I let the silence settle, let the eyes watching me grow more curious by the second. Then I spoke, slowly, just loud enough for them all to hear. "What about that fishing club? Who gave them the right to claim the lake for themselves?" The question dropped like a stone, sending a quick ripple through the group. I saw a few faces instantly change. Some avoided my gaze. Others glanced nervously at Karen. Karen inhaled sharp, her voice rising a notch, laced with restrained fury. "You think you can challenge us? This lake falls under the HOA's management. We have authority over everything. The more you resist, the more trouble you bring upon yourself." The threat landed like a shove toward the edge, and she stood there, waiting to see how soon I would fall. I let the threat hang hang in the air before answering calmly. If this is truly fair management, why hasn't your fishing club received a single citation? They grill, drink, leave trash, and no one dares to say a word. Meanwhile, I sit here fishing on a wooden boat and I'm labeled a disturbance. That's your idea of fairness? She didn't take long to respond. Karen Whitmore curled her lip, her eyes narrowing with smugness, then spoke slowly and deliberately, as if underlining every word for all to hear. They know how to behave. They don't offend the neighbor's eyes. The words behave and offend came from her mouth not as an explanation, but as sharp contempt. I felt every word like a thorn pressing into my skin. Cold, cutting, and full of disdain. She didn't need proof, didn't need logic. All she needed was that twisted comparison to make me the eyesore in everyone's view. I turned to look at the crowd behind me. Many faces still held that same indifferent expression. But in the midst of that silence, I caught a few muffled curses coming from a distant corner. Came from people who couldn't stomach the injustice, who were angry on my behalf, but their voices were low, too low to cross the wall of power Karen had built. I realized those sounds weren't public support, but the helpless frustration of people who knew exactly how easily she could ruin their lives. One loud sentence could turn into a violation letter, a fine, or even a prolonged campaign of harassment. For a brief moment, I saw conflict in some of the residents' eyes. One turned away, lips pressed tight. Another shook their head in visible frustration. They knew I wasn't wrong. They understood perfectly well that the fishing club had done far worse than my wooden boat ever could. But none of them dared to step forward. I could see the weight of fear on their shoulders. Fear Karen had carefully cultivated through countless past incidents, cases where anyone who pushed back was crushed by so-called community rule. I took a deep breath and reminded myself to stay calm. I knew an outburst wouldn't shift the balance. It would only make me the perfect target for Karen and those eagerly waiting to watch it happen. She still stood there, her eyes flashing with satisfaction as she saw no one move toward me. She thought the silence meant agreement, that I had been cornered, left with no one on my side. But in that very moment, I realized something important. The silence had begun to crack. Even the smallest curses, however faint, were seeds of resistance. I kept my gaze fixed on Karen, letting her know I heard and understood every word. I didn't need to shout, didn't need to lose my temper. I only needed her to see that I hadn't flinched. Inside me, the anger was transforming into resolve. Every insult she hurled, every word that made the crowd lower their eyes, only fueled my determination. She might win this moment, might walk away with that smug smile, but I knew the truth. And that truth, once revealed, would show the entire community the real face behind the word behavior. Karen took a few steps back, turned toward her group, and signaled that the confrontation was over. The crowd slowly began to scatter. Some glanced at me with uneasy expression. Others looked down, pretending to be occupied, afraid to be caught, revealing any reaction. I remained where I was, my hand clenched beside the boat, staring into the space where the insults passed. In my mind, a certainty rose, sharp and undeniable. They hadn't spoken yet, but they had started to see. And when the balance one day shifts, it will be those silent witnesses who remember exactly what happened here. I walked slowly toward the boat, my eyes never leaving the surface of the lake. The gentle ripples reflected the sunlight, reminding me of the rare stillness I once had before Karen arrived. But this stillness was no longer a passive peace, but the quiet that comes before a storm. I knew the moment would come when I would no longer be standing alone. And when it did, the words of contempt spoken today would come crashing back onto the face of the one who uttered them. I walked slowly onto the wooden dock, the boards creaking beneath my feet, each step sending a wave of tension through the silent crowd watching. In my hand was a folder I had prepared in advance, pages I had spent many nights researching, with every detail verified. I stood in the center of the path, facing directly toward Karen Whitmore, my eyes locked on her face. My voice rose, low, clear, tearing through the heavy air. You like rules? Here's the real one. This lake doesn't belong to the HOA. It belongs to me. The air seemed to freeze. I heard the sharp intake of breath from those around me, followed by a long silence. No one reacted in time. The crowd was stunned, eyes widened in shock, mouths parted slightly, but no sound came out. The folder in my hand wasn't just talk. It held actual legal documents, formal ownership papers signed and recognized by law. I raised them high, letting the sunlight hit the pages so everyone could clearly see the red seal and the signature. Karen froze, the confidence she had worn like armor vanishing in an instant. Her face went pale, her hand trembled slightly, and she stammered out broken words. Her voice choked. You're lying. It was no longer her usual sharp tone, but the panic of someone cornered in the dark. The people beside her began glancing at one another, doubt spreading through the ranks that had once stood so firmly with the HOA. I held the folder upright and stepped forward, closing the distance between us. This is the truth. Everything you've built, your absurd regulation, Your citation. They only stood because of a false foundation. Foundation just collapsed. As of today, this lake is no longer under your control. My voice wasn't loud, but it echoed, bouncing off the still surface of the water. Murmurs began rising from the crowd. A young woman lifted her phone to record, trying to capture every second of this rare moment. An older man nodded slowly, the faintest smile crossing his face, his eyes showing the relief of someone who had been crushed for years. Meanwhile, a few of Karen's closest allies whispered frantically, trying to ease the tension, but no one was listening, and every eye was fixed on the folder in my hand, on the pages unraveling the illusion the HOA had carefully constructed. Karen stepped back, then tried to regain her composure. She spoke loudly, though her voice had lost its steadiness. "File means nothing. The HOA will sue you. We won't let a troublemaker like you turn everything upside down." I looked her straight in the eyes, gave a faint smile, and replied, "If it means nothing, then why is your face shaking like—" The question caught in her throat. She had no answer. In that moment, I realized the silence was no longer complicity. It had shifted, become anticipation. The residents who once bowed their heads were now lifting them, their eyes flickering with hope. They wanted to see Karen stripped of her facade. They wanted to witness the collapse of her fabricated power, and I knew that moment was drawing near. I lowered the folder, my voice steady. "I don't need anyone to take my word for it. These documents speak for themselves. This lake is privately owned, and the name on the deed is mine. You've grown used to treating it like your backyard, used to imposing and insulting anyone who didn't fit your mold. From now on, the tide has turned. This lake will no longer be a tool for arrogance and discrimination." Karen stood frozen, her lips moving but no sound coming out. The murmurs behind her began to swell. Someone turned and walked away without a word. Someone else laughed openly. I could see it clearly now. The wall Karen had spent years building was cracking. Brick by brick, it was coming down. Not because I shouted, but because the truth had shattered it beyond repair. She was still standing, but the authority she once radiated had almost entirely faded, and I knew this was only the beginning. The lake that had once been the HOA's weapon of control was now mine to wield, and with it, I wouldn't just protect myself. I would open a path for this entire community to see who truly deserved to be exposed. I stepped forward and placed the folder on a wooden table near the edge of the lake. The slap of the pages hitting the surface echoed sharply. I opened to the most important page and held it up for the crowd to see, the red seal and clear signature catching the light. "From this moment on, your club is gone. Everyone has the right fish equally, except those who discriminate." My voice didn't rise, but it carried. Every word dropped like a hammer against the pride of Karen Whitmore. The crowd erupted. Applause burst forth, scattered at first, then swelling into full rhythmic waves. Some people cheered, someone whistled. Laughter rang out, bright and unrestrained, as if they had been waiting for this moment for years. They looked at each other, their faces lit with something unfamiliar. The tension of all those years seemed to break apart beneath the sound of clapping. Faces that had once turned downward in silence were now lifted, radiant and satisfied. Karen stood frozen in place, her eyes wild as if she wanted to tear the paper off the table. Her hands trembled, lips pressed tight, her pale face darkening into a deep, furious red. The pride she had always worn was now peeled away, exposed in front of those she had once commanded. I saw her struggling to breathe, fists clenched at her sides, but everything she did only made her unravel more. The crowd watched, and they knew exactly who had lost. Someone in the crowd called out, "Now that's real justice!" Another added, "We've had enough." Voices of agreement rose like waves, crashing against Karen in layers. She glanced around, searching for a look of support, but those who had once stood behind her were silent. Many even looked away, as if afraid of being swept into a storm that could no longer be stopped. I stood still, needing no more words. Folder lay there, like an indictment that could not be denied. I knew I had just ignited the beginning of a chain, not just for myself, but for every resident who had lived under this weight far too long. They had seen the truth, and once truth is revealed, no fabricated power can hide behind it any longer. In the harsh sunlight reflecting off the lake, I caught the last tremble at the edge of Karen's mouth. She had realized things would never go back to how they were, that the one she saw as weakest now held the greatest power. And this time, the truth was not on her side. Would you dare to stand up and speak truth in front of a crowd like that? Leave a comment. The next morning, I woke up early and prepared a notice, printed in multiple copies. Every sentence I had written was concise, clear, and left no room for interpretation. I delivered it to every household in the neighborhood, posted one on the community bulletin board directly in front of the HOA office, and left another at the lakeside where people often gathered. The message was unambiguous. The fishing club established by the HOA was permanently disbanded, all related activities were canceled, and every member who had once enjoyed favoritism was now banned from the lake in any form. I asserted my ownership ownership and made it clear that the lake was now private property, open fairly to all residents, but firmly closed to those who carried prejudice and abused power. It didn't take long for the news to spread throughout the neighborhood. Whispers traveled down every walkway, in front of every house. Some were surprised, some applauded, and of course, some were furious. But what mattered was this. Everyone understood that the tide had turned. For years, they had viewed the HOA as an untouchable force. Now, seeing that a very powerful group shut out from the land they thought they controlled, left everyone stunned. By late afternoon, Karen appeared. She brought a small group with her, clearly shaken by the absence of many once loyal faces. She marched straight toward where I stood near the dock, shrieking, her voice cracking with rage. "You can't do this!" Her eyes were bloodshot, her hands trembling, like someone who had just lost private possession they had long considered theirs by default. I turned to face her, calm enough that even she faltered for a moment. "Not only can I do it, I already have." I spoke slowly, each word deliberate, loud enough for everyone gathered around to hear. The response stopped Karen in her track. For a split second, shock flickered across her face. She was used to fear, to people stepping back. But today, in front of the crowd, she had just been hit with a reality she couldn't deflect. Residents nearby had gathered to watch, many of their eyes lit satisfaction. Some clapped quietly, others exchanged looks of relief, as if they were finally witnessing something they had thought would never happen. Karen glanced around, seeking support, but the more she searched, the more she saw that the familiar faces were gone. She looked lost in the very crowd that used to treat her as the one in charge. I stepped forward, my voice steady and firm. "For years, you and your group turned this lake into your private tool. You fined people for nonsense while letting your friends party, litter, and push others aside. That ends now. All those privileges stopped today." Crowds stirred louder. Several people nodded. Applause came again, this time stronger, more assured. Karen clenched her eyes flaring, but she knew the words I had just spoken were truth everyone had witnessed. Her anger was no longer enough to silence the community, and that was what unsettled her most. I could see the confusion in her eye, something I had never seen from the moment I moved. The atmosphere had shifted completely. It was no longer the suffocating space where one person gave orders and everyone obeyed. It was a community beginning to find its voice again. I saw a few residents step closer, offering support simply by being present. A middle-aged man spoke up loudly. "That's right, it's time for a change." His words were a spark to dry grass, and the wave of agreement spread. Karen turned away, her shoulders rigid, but her steps were no longer steady. She had lost her ground right on the battlefield. AA she once believed was untouchable. I stood still, feeling each gust of wind brushing across the lake, and I knew this was only the beginning. Once the wheel starts turning, there's no stopping it. Karen could scream, she could thrash, but her manufactured power had begun to crumble, and today's unapologetic retaliation would echo through this community for a long time. I didn't let the disbanding of the club end with just a notice. That afternoon, I sat down with a representative from an environmental conservation group I had contacted earlier. They were invested in protecting natural lakes within residential areas, aiming to turn them into shared spaces that promoted ecosystem awareness. I read through each clause carefully, underlined the key points, and signed. With a single signature, the lake officially became a community ecological zone, open to all residents, no longer a private playground for the HOA elite. The news spread like wildfire. Families who had once been driven away, people who had stayed silent to avoid trouble, now came to the lake more freely. They brought their children, a few old men carried worn-out fishing rods, and some simply came to enjoy the view. No one had to bow to HOA rule, and no one feared Karen showing up with a citation. The atmosphere around the lake transformed entirely. The air filled with laughter, faint smell of picnic, ease of movement, and I knew without a doubt I had chosen the right path. Karen showed up not long after, but this time she came without her usual entourage. She stood still for a moment at the path leading to the wooden dock, her eyes sweeping across the faces of those now leisurely enjoying the space. Instead of avoiding her gaze, many looked straight back. Some smirked, others leaned in to whisper within their group. The contempt was no longer hidden, it showed plainly, like a scar across the face of former power. Karen took a few steps forward, about to speak, but before she could say a word, an elderly woman cut in. "This place belongs to everyone now. If you have something to say, keep it to yourself." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to draw laughter from those nearby. Karen froze, clearly unaccustomed to being confronted so openly. In the past, a single cleared throat from her would bring silence. Now, that silence had turned into defiance. I stood near the dock, watching calmly. Karen caught sight of me, her eyes flashing, but this time she didn't approach. I could see the struggle in her expression, arrogance collapsing into helplessness. For the first time since I arrived in this neighborhood, Karen Whitmore was truly experiencing what it felt like to be pushed out, rejected by the very community she once controlled. No one told her to leave. No one forced her out, but the steady stream of scornful looks struck like invisible blades, pushing her back one step at a time. I saw her shoulders tremble, her lips pressed tight, but she had no move to make. She turned, walking quickly toward the road leading away from the lake, her figure growing smaller behind the sound of quiet laughter that still echoed in the air. In that moment, I understood the real battle was still ahead, but the change had already begun. This community had opened its eyes. They had seen what the collapse of false power looked like. And with every contemptuous glance thrown Karen's way, I became more certain that I had struck deepest her isolation. A young man from the neighborhood had managed to capture the exact moment Karen Whitmore froze as I presented the lake ownership document. The video was quickly uploaded to social media, initially attracting just a few dozen views, but by the end of the afternoon, the number had skyrocketed into the thousands. The sounds of applause and cheers from the residents rang out clearly, while Karen's face appeared filled with horror, her eyes blazing with rage. Yet, that image spread faster than any retelling ever could, becoming living proof of everything the residents had whispered about but never dared to say aloud. Comments flooded in beneath the post. She got what she deserved. Another read, "How can someone be that awful, using HOA power to bully neighbors?" One commenter wrote, "He's the one who truly deserves to run this place, fair and transparent." Each line, each share, was like a hammer striking down on the carefully constructed image Karen had spent years building. People had long grown tired of stories about HOA abuse, and now they had the perfect example to pour all their frustration in. Within just one night, the video appeared across various platforms. Some local news outlets even picked it up, running headlines designed to stir curiosity. HOA president exposed by resident at the lake. The incident had grown beyond the boundaries of our neighborhood, spreading across the city and becoming a hot topic in cafes and online forums alike. I received dozens of messages from complete strangers who shared that they too had once been mistreated by their HOAs, fined for petty reasons, and bullied into silence. They said the video gave them a sense of satisfaction, as if justice had been served on their behalf. Within the community, the ripple effect just as strong. Families who had stayed quiet began to grow bolder. A young mother brought her child to the lake and whispered to me, "Thanks to you, we feel like we have the right to be here." An elderly man who usually sat silently on his porch came up to shake my hand tightly, his eyes sparkling with joy. People no longer avoided eye contact or whispered behind closed doors. They began speaking out, discussing things openly, sharing stories. The silence that had gripped this neighborhood for years was starting to crack. Meanwhile, Karen had all but disappeared from public life. She no longer had the courage to show her face at the lake, nor did she stand before crowds shouting orders like she used to. Anytime she did appear, contemptuous stares immediately found her. Someone even said loudly to her face, "She still dares to show up?" Just weeks earlier, no one would have dared say such a thing. Now those words rang out freely, without shame or hesitation. I quietly observed the shift taking place, clearly sensing an undercurrent rising. The video didn't just humiliate Karen, it sparked a wave of resistance across the community. People began to believe that false authority could be taken down, that truth, once brought into the light, forced even the most arrogant to bow their head. And I understood that once this wave of momentum had started, it would only grow stronger, tearing through every glossy layer Karen had painted over the crowd's sense of satisfaction didn't stop at a viral video. It turned into fuel for the residents to rethink how they lived within this neighborhood. They were no longer timid around the HOA, no longer treated Karen's orders as absolute. They now saw her as just a woman propped up by artificial power, and the whole world had witnessed how flustered and shaken she became when confronted with the truth. The spread of the video didn't stop at gossip or online comment. It quietly seeped back into the neighborhood, where people had spent years towing around in fear and silence. I began to notice heads held a little higher, eyes that used to dart away when Karen Whitmore approached, now steadily meeting one another. Neighbors nodded to each other during brief encounters at their front yards. Some families gathered out back to talk, and the once whispered conversations now rose into clearly spoken words. One evening, as I passed through the northern section of the lake, I came upon 5 or 6 families sitting together. They had set out chairs and tables on the porch, lights bright, voices sharp as they dissected everything the HOA had done. A man I remembered for quietly paying off unfair fines now said said loudly, "We can't let her keep pushing us around. Now the whole city knows who she really is. What's there to fear?" A younger woman added, "If he had the courage to stand up, why can't we?" They talked about filing petitions, demanding an audit of the HOA budget, and even forming an independent oversight. Things that once felt far-fetched were suddenly becoming the core topics of every backyard conversation. The atmosphere had shifted unmistakably. I could feel the quiet movement underneath, like waves building beneath the lake's surface. Many once silent residents now openly showed their support. They greeted me with trusting eyes, and some even dropped by my house, leaving small notes that read, "We're ready when you are." I read those words and knew I was no longer alone. The fear that had bound this community for so long had been broken, replaced by a collective resolve, still cautious but strong enough to threaten the very foundation of Karen's authority. In the days that followed, transformation became even more apparent. The violation letters by the HOA no longer silenced people instantly. One resident even brought a letter down to the lake, held it up in front of neighbors, and tore it to pieces, an act that drew applause from those around. The HOA meeting, once dominated by Karen's monologue, were now disrupted by a barrage of pointed people began demanding transparency in the books, asking why dues kept rising while services remained stagnant. Karen tried to maintain her usual tone, but the chorus of dissent grew too loud, drowning out the shrill voice she had long used to impose her will. I watched it all unfold and understood that a wall had crumbled. Karen was no longer the figure the entire community feared. She had become the face of deceit and injustice. The authority she once wore like a crown, built on silence, fear, collapsed in an instant. When the light of truth shone through, every layer of faux dignity peeled away, exposing a solitary woman trembling under the scornful eyes of her neighbors. I walked out of that meeting and saw faces glowing with quiet triumph. They chatted freely, no longer retreating into familiar shadows. I knew the road ahead would still hold clashes and resistance, but this moment marked a turning point. From a silenced, suppressed community, they had begun to liberate themselves, and it had all started with a single truth, revealed at the right time, brought Karen's wall of power crashing down for everyone to see. As the noise surrounding the viral video began to fade, the neighborhood stirred with a different kind of upheaval, this time not sparked by violation notices or tense meetings, but by the quiet unraveling of those who once stood confidently behind Karen Whitmore. One by one, they began to withdraw. Some sent resignation letters to the HOA board, while others quietly packed up and left fishing club they once clung to as a symbol of status. The gatherings that used to echo with laughter, clinking beer cans, and sizzling grills were now events no one wanted to remember. I saw the flickers of guilt in their eyes when they passed me on the shared pathway, forced greetings, the visible discomfort of those desperate not to be seen as Karen's allies anymore. The fishing club, once quietly promoted as a place for those who knew how to behave, had become a punch. No one dared approach the lake under that banner anymore, knowing that a single photo sparked public backlash. The folding chairs once laid out on the grass had vanished. Piles of beer bottles were gone, not out of remorse, but out of fear, frantic at themselves from the fallout. Privileged away, no one wanted to be caught standing beside Karen. The club's collapse also revealed chaos in the HOA's finance. It turned out that many operating expenses had been funneled through the club. Equipment purchases, vague lake maintenance costs, all buried beneath innocuous labels. When residents began demanding transparency, the numbers were laid bare, impossible to obscure. The shady transactions turned HOA meetings into interrogation. Each board member pressed to explain why dues kept rising while nothing ever improved. Karen tried to keep her tone steady, but line by line, the expense report stripped her defenses, leaving her no room to maneuver. One evening, I stood by the lake, looking out at the empty patch of grass where the club once gathered. The breeze rippled the surface, but the boisterous noise of exclusive revelry was gone. In its place, a group of children ran and laughed, their voices light and free, washing away the heavy memories. The scene brought me a quiet sense of relief, as if the lake had finally been restored to what it was always meant to be, a space for everyone, no longer claimed by any entitled faction. Karen hadn't given up, but the truth was undeniable, and the figure once seen as the most powerful was now isolated. No one wanted to be associated with her, not even those who had once defended her at all costs. Their mass withdrawal felt like a final punctuation mark for the fishing club, and the first fracture in the entire system she had so carefully constructed. I could clearly now. The silence that once protected her had turned into silence that abandoned her. And once a community makes its choice, no fabricated authority can hold its ground. That night, I returned home with a heavy heart, yet a deep sense of peace. The club had officially disbanded. The HOA's finances were in disarray, and Karen was beginning to taste the consequences of her own making. I knew the road ahead road would still be turbulent, but this moment marked an irreversible shift. A false power had crumbled, and a new, fairer community was beginning to rise from its ruin. As the afternoon faded, the lake stretched out in stillness, reflecting the soft light receding on the horizon. I once again sat in my familiar wooden boat, letting the fishing line slip gently into the calm water. There were no more angry footsteps, no more shrill commands from the shore, only the distant calls of birds in the treetops, the gentle lap of water against the hull, all blending into the serenity I had longed for over so many months. This time, peace was not threatened by a violation notice or a watchful glare, but was true freedom, the kind that belongs to someone who knows they have preserved their dignity. I sat upright, drawing in the cool air, letting the sense of relief settle into every breath. The lake had always been beautiful, but today it held a different meaning, a reminder that every struggle had been worthwhile. The chipped paint on the boat, the worn memories embedded in the wood, suddenly felt more precious than ever, because they now existed in a space no longer ruled tyranny. This freedom wasn't granted by anyone. It came from resolve, from the courage to stand firm against a group once seemed untouchable. I raised my coffee and took a sip. The familiar bitterness spread through my mouth, yet strangely, it tasted sweeter than usual. Maybe it was my mood, or maybe it was the image in my mind of Karen Whitmore in the moment her deception was exposed. Face once accustomed to arrogance, to sneering at others, had turned pale, her lips trembling, unable to speak a word. It was a sight I would never forget, not out of simple satisfaction, but because it reminded me that truth holds a power that can bring even the most dominant to their knees. I thought back to my first days here, when Karen was seen as the embodiment of authority. She had once walked through the neighborhood with smug pride, silencing people with a mere clearing of her throat. But that was over. What she received now were scornful look, hushed ridicule, and a suffocating isolation. I remembered clearly the moment she stood among the crowd, her eyes burning as if she could tear the ownership papers apart, but she couldn't do a thing. In that moment, her authority collapsed faster than anyone had imagined. The coffee cup in my hand seemed to mirror that difference. Its flavor hadn't changed, yet the feeling it delivered was entirely new. It was the taste of victory, of calm after the storm, of the belief justice can be restored when people are brave enough. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sweetness linger on my tongue, letting the memory of Karen that day come into focus, then slowly fade, like a film drawing to its final frame. The lake remained still, the sky gradually giving way to dust. I felt my own heart settle, no longer weighed down. I knew I had changed, and so had this community. They had seen the true face of Karen, and from this moment on, she would have no more chances to manipulate anyone under the guise of so-called power. Freedom is not a privilege. It is something everyone deserves. Do you think Karen still has a chance to crawl back after this fall? Leave a comment. As things gradually settled, I looked back on the brief but intense journey that had just unfolded. From a peaceful morning shattered by Karen Whitmore's shouting to the moment the lake ownership documents were presented before the community, it all felt like a sequence of irreversible events. I knew I had to close this story with something definitive, a message not just for myself, for everyone living here. I stood before the crowd, faces that once looked down now lit with belief and resolve. I spoke slowly, every word steady. Justice doesn't only come from a courtroom, it begins the moment you refuse to be stepped on. The words weren't loud or dramatic, but they landed in people's hearts like a stone hitting a still lake, sending ripples outward. I saw eyes glisten, heads nod, neighbors exchanging glances as if to confirm shared understanding. Years of silence had made them forget they could rise up, that their voice carried just as much weight as those who claimed authority. Now they understood HOA wasn't some unpowered group of people with a duty to serve the community. And once truth was laid bare, every fake facade crumbled. In the days that followed, the neighborhood began to. Meetings were no longer Karen's monolith, real forum. People asked, challenged ideas, and, more importantly, stood up again. Constant tension gave fear, and every resident I saw warm. The hesitant faded, placed by a spirit of. Karen still lived here, but she no longer walked like someone in control. Each time she appeared, the looks from her neighbors forced her eyes to the ground. Isolation became the harshest sentence, not issued by a court, but powerful enough to make her realize her time had passed. I didn't feel triumphant, but I saw it as the natural consequence. When someone builds power on arrogance, the truth will always be what tears it down in an instant. For me, the lesson wasn't about winning or losing a confrontation. It was about holding on to dignity. If I had bowed my head when she yelled, If I had stayed silent at the sight of that fine, if I had looked away from the injustice done to the Johnson family, then owning the lake would have meant nothing. Justice only exists when someone dares to speak up, even in front of a hostile crowd. Each morning, I sit on the boat, cast my line into the lake, take a sip of coffee, and feel a sense of ease settle in. I no longer brace for the sound of heels pounding on the wooden dock, no longer flinch at the sharp voice shouting from the shore. Instead, I hear children laughing as they run along the grass, neighbors chatting excitedly about shared concern. The lake is no longer a symbol of oppression. It has returned to being a space of freedom, of connection. I believe this community will never go back to the days of silent compliance. They have seen a wall they thought immovable collapse, witnessed how truth can overpower even the most carefully crafted illusion of authority. And once their heads are held high, once they find the courage to speak, no Karen will ever raise that wall again. Justice, in the end, is built on the courage of ordinary people. That afternoon, I returned once more to my old wooden boat, drifting toward the lakeside that had witnessed so many tense confrontations. The late sun stretched across the water, casting shimmering trails of light. I sat still, letting the calm seep into my skin, a feeling entirely different from those early days when I arrived here. This time, there were no angry footsteps, no figure waiting to slap a citation in my, only the wind rustling through the trees and the faint scent of the lake. I knew everything had changed, not just for me, but for the entire community. I looked down into the water and saw my reflection clearly, not distorted, not trembling. That mirrored image made me pause longer than usual. In the water, I saw a calm man, unburdened by scorn or subjugation, a man proud for standing firm. I used to think justice was something distant, unreachable, but now, with my reflection resting undisturbed on the surface, I understand that justice exists in every small in every moment we refuse to be trampled. This lake, once the setting of my humiliation, had become the reminder of resilience, quiet power. Tiny ripples spread as I dropped a pebble into the water, as if the lake itself agreed with what I felt. I thought of Karen Whitmore, once striding boldly through the community, wielding fake authority to impose suffocating rule. Now, all that remained were the contemptuous glances of her neighbor, the silent withdrawal of those who once cheered her on. Everything she built collapsed the moment the truth came to light. And that lesson isn't just for Karen. It's for anyone who believes power can replace what's right. I closed my eyes briefly, hearing children calling to one another somewhere around the lake. I knew they would grow up in a different kind of community, one where people no longer stay silent in the face of injustice, where truth can be spoken without being silenced by fear. I felt a quiet peace settle over me as I imagined that future. I had done my part, and what remains now is for the next generation to carry it forward. As the sunset dyed the surface of the water red, I looked up, letting the cool evening breeze wash over me. In that stillness, I told myself, with a voice steady like a carved inscription, never give orders on someone else's land. It wasn't just a line to mark today's story, but a principle I wanted to live by for the rest of my life. It served as a warning to those who grew used to imposing their will, and a guiding light for those who had once bowed their heads in. I left the boat as darkness began to settle, walking away with a mindset completely different from the first day I came to the lake. Inside me, there was no more resentment, no more suffocating weight, only calm and pride. I had defended what was right, and in doing so, I had reclaimed respect, both for myself and for all those who had once stood silent in the face of injustice. The lake behind me rippled soft, as if holding on to that final message. For anyone who dares forget that justice always begins when we refuse to be. I walked away from the lake on the final evening of this story, my heart light as though closing a long and stormy chapter. Looking back, it all started on a seemingly peaceful morning, when Karen Whitmore appeared with her shouting and a citation meant to trample a person just to assert her power. That act of domination had made the entire community bow for years, but it also ignited resistance. When the lake ownership documents were revealed in front of everyone, the wall of fabricated authority crumbled, and the truth, once exposed, set free a neighborhood long buried in silence. What remains isn't just my victory over the HOA, but the awakening of neighbors who had lived in fear. They saw that silence protects no one, it only feeds arrogance. When the video went viral, public reaction became a mirror, helping the community realize justice can come from anywhere, from the seemingly small act of one person choosing to stand. And so, families who once avoided the spotlight began to lift their heads, speak up, and come together to shatter the invisible chains Karen had so carefully built. The downfall of the fishing club, the chaos within the HOA's finances, and the image of Karen being abandoned by those who once stood behind her, none of it was merely the collapse of one individual. It was proof of a universal truth. False power never endures when built on injustice and discrimination. Community, no matter how how long it has been suppressed, will eventually find its voice when the truth is brought to light. The lesson is unmistakably clear. Never believe that justice only exists within grand buildings or loud courtroom battle. It begins the moment an ordinary person refuses to be trampled. Don't think a single act of defiance is meaningless, because sometimes one firm step is enough to stir an entire group. And never forget, arrogance will always crumble when it's confronted by truth. I walked away from the lake under the warm glow of the neighborhood's lights, hearing the lively hum of conversations, watching children laugh and play freely on the grass without being shooed away. That scene reminded me that no effort had been in vain. From an old boat once seen as an eyesore to a lake reclaimed for all, this story wasn't just about me and Karen. It was about the power of a community willing to lift its head. And if there's only one thing worth remembering, it's this: justice always lives in hearts that refuse to bow.